Hello and welcome to another week of Atheism for Lent, where we delve into the interesting dialogue between theism and atheism, and we explore how this binary that we're all so used to is actually more fluid than we might think, and that there is a theological dimension to atheism. I was actually just in a taxi tonight and got into a great conversation with the taxi driver who was listening to Christopher Hitchens on audiobook, and I was telling him about this course, and it was really interesting. He's a really nice guy. He's educating himself on YouTube, and he comes from Northern Ireland, and we were talking, and in Northern Ireland the divide between theism and atheism seems utterly unbreachable. It's like in America between Republican and Democrat. It's almost like sometimes you can't imagine how a productive, mutually enriching discussion could happen. And we were chatting, I was telling him about this course, and he was quite shocked that there were thousands of people around the world who were doing this Atheism for Lent. And how there were people who were theists, atheists, agnostics, all doing this course together, opening themselves up to thinking about material that maybe in the past they would have been concerned about or not read. And he found this mind-blowing. And it reminded me that the first time I talked about doing Atheism for Lent to people, they said to me, a few different people, there was a minister said, "You're not going to find 10 people in Belfast who are from a church who will want to read Atheism for Lent." And what's beautiful is actually not only is there 10 people in Belfast, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who have done this course, and it's quite interesting, So I hope that you're getting something out of it. So far we had the introduction, the first few days, where we just looked at some concrete manifestations of dialectics, where people go into the darkness to find the light. They go into the doubt to find a certain certainty, a certain peace. They go into suffering to find a certain healing. And just saw how that process is something that is one that we know in our personal lives, and a lot of artists and philosophers and various people talk about, that you must lose your life in order to find it. And then what we're doing is we're pushing that to the extreme. We're weirdly saying, well, perhaps the more you go into atheism, the more you will find something that will open something up that I don't know if you would want to call it theism or post-theism, whatever, but it will open up something that might be quite surprising. So that's what we're doing. The second week, then we looked at some of the standard arguments against the existence of God, the ones we all know. The idea that there is evil in the world and an all-powerful and all-good God wouldn't allow for unnecessary suffering. Of course you can justify suffering of some kind, but whenever you encounter completely unnecessary suffering, what do we do with that? And the invisible gardener, a few other arguments. Then last week we did something that will be initially surprising to some people, because we took one of the most famous arguments for the existence of God, which is the ontological argument, and showed that actually this famous argument for the existence of God is actually also an argument against the existence of God, or it's an argument that all of our concepts of God fall short, even the concept of existence. And that was the beginning of showing how atheism occurs within the theistic and the religious world. So one of the earliest forms of atheism is actually mysticism. The mystics who were always denaming God, always questioning God, seeing atheism as a purifying practice, but not because they were against this concept of God, but it was actually precisely their commitment to that concept and that idea that led them to this really interesting place of affirmation and negation. And what happens with the mystics is they talk about this ascension. that you might start off with very basic concepts of God, that God is in the sky. And then as you move forward, you go, well, no, God's not literally in the sky. In fact, we live in a universe where there is no up or down. So God is not up there. So maybe you use the metaphor of God is on high. And then you go a bit deeper and you say, well, God is on high is really a metaphor that is saying that God is the name we give to the ground of all things. And the mystics then widen this out, open this out to say that the deeper you go into your faith, the more you go into a type of atheism. But it's an atheism that somehow resonates with some of the deepest ways of approaching God within the Christian tradition and other traditions as well. So that was an approach that they were taking. This week, we're going to go in the other direction. And this is a direction that I'm very, very interested in. Although I have loved everything that I'm offering you. I personally have benefited from. I love what I do because I get to share with you some of the thinkers and the writers and the activists who have really impacted my life. So each of these stages, each of these weeks that I introduce you to are groups of people who, to greater or lesser extent, I have really benefited from personally. But this week has a special place in my heart. I remember when I really first started to read these, the great materialists, the great masters of suspicion, they were called. I find their work challenging, disturbing and inspiring all at the same time. And so people like Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Feuerbach, they all have a real place in my heart. So I'm glad that I'm able to talk about them. And these thinkers, they are coming from mostly outside of the theological tradition. There's one thinker we could have put in the mix, was Kierkegaard, but we haven't done that. I haven't put him into Atheism for Lent yet, maybe next year. But these thinkers are critical, highly critical of Christianity. So what you're going to read this week are a number of people who are... now it ranges. You've got people like Emma Goldman, who is just this phenomenal writer. You're going to love her essay. Absolutely brilliant essay. I've given you an excerpt of it and then also the whole thing. So if you want, you can read the whole thing. She's very, very much coming from the outside. She doesn't like Christianity at all. And then you've got Feuerbach on the other side, who's one of my personal favourites. He's actually very sympathetic to Christianity. But he says theology is anthropology. So his whole thing is that the secret of theology is that it actually tells us about ourselves. Just like when you see someone who has a dog and the dog often looks like the owner, you can tell a lot about an owner by the dog they have, right? Because you symbolize a lot in your dog, whether it's a poodle or a bulldog or whatever. In the same way, you can tell a lot about a person by the gods that they have. Or you can tell a lot about a community by the gods that they worship. So Feuerbach is saying that theology is an incredible endeavour. We're going to look at this in a second, but he wants to say theology is an essential part of humanity, that religion is an essential part of the development of humanity. But we have to realise that it was never really talking about God. It was talking about human beings. It was talking about something much more earthy. So you've got Joe Hill and Emma Goldman on one side, and you've got Feuerbach and interestingly Marx on the other, who are both quite sympathetic to religion, but coming from the outside. But these thinkers, they want to take seriously historical Christianity. So there's actually 4 things I want to cover in this introductory seminar that these thinkers all hold in common to some extent. One of them is the history of religion. The other is the genesis of religion, the function of religion, and the end of religion. So I just want to take each of those in turn. There is the history of religion, the genesis of religion, the function of religion, and the end of religion. And each of these individuals, of course, are complex and they have differences. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw together some family resemblances, some things that they might to a greater or lesser extent hold in common. But as you know, this is a meal. Atheism for Lent is this tasting menu. And I am bringing a new course to you with a variety of things to sample. And they're not all the same, but I think they go together. That's the key. They go together. So, the first thing, the history of religion. Well, what do I mean by that? Each of these thinkers is interested in Christianity as an historical religion. They are pretty critical of the mystics. They don't critique the mystics, but they're like, okay, the more mystical you get, and the more abstract God gets, fair enough. But Feuerbach was really one of the first philosophers to take seriously at a philosophical level historical religion. So Feuerbach says, well, the mystics are great, but the majority of religious people aren't mystics. In fact, the majority of religious people wouldn't even know how to make sense of the mystics. Right? The majority of religious people are interested in a God who fights, who changes his mind, who has genders, who is very anthropomorphic. You read the Bible and you have a God who speaks a language. You have a God who has a chosen people. You have a God who interferes in battles, who makes the sun stand still, which is actually quite easy because the sun doesn't move. But but all of these things that happen, this is not the mystical God. And whenever you see believers going to church on a Sunday, the hymns that they sing and the sermons that they listen to isn't very mystical. There's something very earthy, and all of these thinkers are basically saying we're not interested in whether God exists or not in some abstract way. And we're also not interested in some mystical notion of God. Hey, maybe that's true. They're wanting to say, how do we make sense of religion as it's practiced by millions of people around the world, right? And they're of course most interested in Christianity because that's the religion that they know. So they go in a different direction. And they're not, as I say, they're not atheists in the modern new atheist sense. Nietzsche, Marx, Freud, Feuerbach, Goldman, Hill, none of them have an argument against the existence of God. What they have is, because that wouldn't even make sense to them, by the way, that wouldn't make sense to many of these thinkers, because that presupposes that you can stand outside the universe and contemplate metaphysical questions beyond physics, the metaphysics beyond physics, and come to some sort of answer. And these thinkers in different ways have a philosophical reason for being skeptical of that, what's called speculative philosophy. That's not just what speculative philosophy it is, but it's speculation. They're speculating about metaphysics. And most of these thinkers are very, very attuned to the idea that we think from within a language and a tradition and a history. They're not skeptics, they're not nihilists, but they are saying that in order to reach conclusions, we have to take seriously that we are embedded in the world and in a language, and questions that exceed our experience, speculative questions, don't really get us anywhere. You can argue in philosophy for freedom or for determinism. You can argue for God or against God. All of these big questions, and you can go in both the opposite directions and seem to make a reasonable argument. And these thinkers are going, okay, we're going to lay that to one side, and we're going to just take seriously what is religion as it is practiced, and what is Christianity in its historical form. Which is, by the way, a very theological way of thinking, particularly with Christianity. Christianity has always seen itself as a historical religion. The idea of God becoming human, right, entering into human culture and language. So this notion of actually taking seriously how Christianity is practiced within the world is a theological notion that Luther was very big on, and Protestantism was very big on. It is very big on. So that's the first thing. In the opposite direction from going out to an abstract God, we argue whether God exists or not, they go, right, no, let's look at the phenomenology, the phenomenon of religion as it's practiced. Secondly, then, these thinkers, to greater and lesser extents, offer an alternative theory of the genesis of religion. And Feuerbach is really the first to do this. What happens is, really before Feuerbach, there wasn't systematic alternatives to understanding why people are religious. What do people get out of it? It's kind of similar to pre-Darwin, when there were definitely theories of evolution around, but there was no scientific system of evolution. And so the notion of the universe having order, complexity, and purpose, and an intelligence behind it seemed like and was the best explanation people had. Well, not everybody accepted that, but it was definitely the most plausible explanation for what we saw in the universe. It seemed to be similar to, as William Paley said, a watch. A watch seems to have design. We know there's a designer, a watch designer. The universe, or the world at least, seems hospitable to life. It is hospitable to life. It seems finely tuned to life. And therefore we can assume there's an intelligence behind it. Now with Darwin, he wasn't attacking that. He wasn't setting his sights against that. But he offered an alternative explanation. There was a natural explanation, and that natural explanation made sense of our experience in a way that was as wide and deep. Now, not initially, by the way. Initially, it would still be competing against the teleological view of the universe. It would still be small, but what Darwin started grew into a systematized body of knowledge that made sense of our natural world. In the same way, Feuerbach and Freud, they're two of the ones who do this best, they began to give an alternative way of understanding why religion exists, why it's there, how did it come about, a natural explanation, one that didn't require a notion of the gods or God. Just to take Freud as an example, Freud's views on religion are very interesting, but let me take an example that happens in psychoanalysis, something that Freud perceived. Freud realized early on, he noticed that if you have a father and your father dies, your father can continue to have an influence in your life long after he's died. That just because your father has passed away, it doesn't mean that they have passed away as an object within you. So you might, for example, be always trying to please your mother or your father, or always trying to rebel against them. And when they die, without you even realizing, you continue to act in such a way that you're trying to please them or piss them off, right? You're still going out with certain people, not maybe because you like them, but because you think your parents would like them, or you think your parents wouldn't like them, right? And the notion here is, Freud says, well, your father has died, but remains alive within you. And here's the interesting thing as well, is a real father or a real mother, they don't see you all the time. Right? If you're a child and you do something bad when your parents aren't watching, right, you can get away with it. So that whenever the parents are external authorities, you can hide things. Now, gradually, as you're a child, something happens, and Elf on a Shelf is a good example of this. When I went to America, I found this tradition. I don't know if it's a big tradition, but it's called Elf on the Shelf. And I think it's Christmas, maybe it's not Christmas, but you put like an elf out, and I guess this elf is watching you when your parents aren't, right? And interesting about the Elf on the Shelf is, right, even when your parents aren't around, this elf on the shelf is watching you. And then eventually, as you grow up, as you internalize that gaze, you can feel guilty when no one's watching you. You can feel like you're doing something wrong whenever no one's around, right? So the external authority that you can act behind their back is now internal to you. So Slavoj Žižek uses a very good example of this, if I can share it with you. He says, like, traditionally, you have a kid who wants to go and see their auntie. And the parents might say, you got to go and see your auntie. And the kid goes, I don't want to see auntie. I don't like auntie. She has cold hands and I'll get bored, right? Traditional parents, what do they say? They say, get your coat and get in the car. I don't care if you want to see her or not. You're going to see her, right? Now, then you jump to modern parents. So like the typical modern parent, you have to go and see auntie. And the kid says, I don't want to go and see auntie. She's got cold hands and, I'm going to be bored. And then they sit the little child down and they go, listen, auntie really loves you. And you really love auntie. And you don't want to disappoint her, do you? You want to do the right thing. I know that you want to do the right thing, don't you? Right? Now, the interesting thing about this is we all think that that's the better way, right? But there's a certain problem with it. Well, one is we know it's only a game. Because if the little kid says, no, I'm fine, I'm just going to play the Xbox, the parents are going to revert to strategy A and say, right, get your coat on, get in the car, you're going to see her, right? But the other thing is, the problem for the child is not only do you have to go and see auntie, but you have to want to. You are being taught to internally police yourself, right? In the first example, you have to go and see auntie. You're a kid. You can't fight your parents, right? You can't leave home, but at least you can have a little bit of internal resistance, right? You can say, when I'm old enough, I'm not going to do that, right? But in the second example, you don't have any internal resistance because your own consciousness is turned against you. So you have to like it. So this is why there's a really interesting reading of the first commandment. It says, God says, you shall have no other gods before me. And the interesting thing about this is if you really take it literally, it sounds like God is saying, you shall have no other gods in front of me. Which means, listen, behind my back you can have other gods, but just don't do it in public, right? In public, whenever I'm around, play the game, right? Which is like a father or mother saying to their kid, listen, you can't drink, don't drink. But there's a little nod and a wink that, hey, if you're at your friend's house and you're all safe, of course you can have a drink, but just don't do it publicly. Be discreet about it, right? And actually, there's even a bit of disappointment in the parents if they find out that their kid's not doing any drinking, right? Now, the problem is that's great because you have this demand, but you also have the permission to transgress the command a little bit, have a bit of fun. But when the command is not just external, but it's internalized, it's colonized your internal space, you have nowhere to escape from it. Yeah? So in Los Angeles, the tyranny is happiness, the command is you have to enjoy. And you go to a party and everyone has to pretend they're having a great time and they're successful and happy. But the great thing is you can go to the bathroom and be depressed, right? You go to the bathroom and you go like, oh, and then you go back out and it's fine. You go to a party, pretend everything's wonderful, you have a good time, you go home. But the problem is when that external demand to be happy is internalized and you actually so internalize that there is no bathroom to go to, that you're always telling yourself you have to be happy, whole, complete, you have to be having a good time, and you can't go to the bathroom to be a bit sad because they're all doing cocaine there, right? And so there's no escape from the tyranny of happiness. This is what Freud is talking about, is that when the real father dies, the internal father sees everything. Because your real father can say, or your real mother, your real siblings, they can say, don't try to please me. Go live your own life. But the internal one doesn't say that. The internal one's even stronger. So Freud has this weird mythology. I'm not going to give it in its entirety, but it's basically like this. Way back in prehistory, power was very material. So maybe you had hordes of people that lived together, or like Neanderthals or whatever. And there would be a leader, and the leader had all the power, and they had all the authority, and they made demands of the community, but they also held it together. And then we imagine what would happen is that this leader, people would start to feel jealous of him, right? They would kill the leader. And Freud says there would be a leader, a man, so a powerful man, who the tribe would then get increasingly jealous of and then eventually kill. But when they kill this leader, they're not freed. They have guilt over it. And also the horde is under threat of dissipating, falling apart. And so they create a totem. And the totem is a way of keeping the father figure alive in the community. And they gather around the totem, and they the power of that leader now is ethereal. And this is kind of like the beginning of religion. That religion takes over from a very physical type of material power, and it becomes more ethereal. And that basically keeps the community together, and it solves a series of problems. Now, connected with that, and this is where I can bring Foyer back in a little bit, you can see how this ethereal figure has certain advantages over a real individual, a real leader, or a real mother or father, because this figure is all powerful. This figure is now immortal. This figure, whereas a person can love you, but then they can love someone else or they can die, this figure remains. And this figure can protect in a way that a real leader might not be able to. And so then superstition comes in. People how to kind of like influence this spiritual being in order to protect them and love them and care for them. Now, I'm giving you a very, let's call it a nutshell, a very kind of like brief overview of one way of thinking about the genesis of religion, that it comes from a real material power that is then becomes more spiritual and mythical, and actually in that very move becomes more powerful. Just like in psychoanalysis, an analyst has to help you realize that often the figures you're trying to please in your life, who might have died in the real world, are still alive in you, and you have to let them go, that negative part, in your own internal world. They have died there outside, but they haven't died within you, and they continue to make demands on you. So that's one way of thinking about the genesis of religion in a very broad sense, and why we start to conceive of some sort of all-powerful being that's out there. But then now I want to jump on to the third thing, which is the function of religion. So we've got the history of religion. These people take seriously religion as it's practiced. God as God is spoken of by real people. Secondly, the genesis of religion, where Freud is thinking about very seriously, looking at historically at an alternative to a supernatural explanation, right? Where people say, well, we believe in gods because gods have spoken. We believe in gods because there are miracles. We wouldn't believe in God if God didn't exist. Whereas Voltaire said, if God did not exist, we would have to invent God. Whereas there's a certain desire for a God. Actually, in the reading that you have of Freud's, he does a fascinating argument about where he talks about religion as an illusion. And he makes a very important distinction between a delusion and an illusion. And this also then shows you how Freud is not interested in saying God doesn't exist. Because he says, if you're deluded, you believe something that is contrary to reality. So if you're deluded, you might think that the CIA are out to get you. Well, actually, that would be more of an illusion. Let me think of something else. Maybe if you're deluded, you think that someone has implanted microchips in your teeth, and there are aliens communicating to you, telling you to do things. Whatever it is, this is like a psychotic delusion. An illusion is different. Freud says an illusion is something that you are libidinally invested in. You have an illusion like you're in the desert and you're really thirsty and you see an oasis. This illusion, it's an illusionary oasis. And Freud says, well, the difference between a delusion and an illusion is a delusion is ridiculous, right? We all know it's ridiculous when we hear it, right? There's no truth to it at all. An illusion could be true, and it might not be. And he uses the example of a little girl who dreams of being a princess. Like, that's an illusion, because like lots of little girls dream about being a princess, because there's something libidinally in that is desirous. But that little girl might actually find out that she actually is a princess, and so it's still an illusion, because she's a libidinal investment in it. It just happens to be true. Just like Lacan says, if you think your partner is cheating on you and you're pathologically jealous, and then you discover that your partner is cheating on you, that doesn't mean you're not pathologically jealous. It just means that your pathological jealousy happens to be correct. So Freud says that in terms of a lot of religious stuff, he says, I don't want to call it a delusion, because, hey, it might be true, but I want to call it an illusion, because people have all sorts of rational reasons to believe in a God, but he goes through those and says they're not really that rational, not even that irrational, but they're not knockdown arguments. So he says there's something in us that wants a God. There's something in us that is religious, that desires that, and that's what he wants to understand, is where does that interest arise? So for someone like Freud, the existence or inexistence of God is just a brute fact. That's not much interest. What's of interest to him is why we would want God to exist, or why we would want God not to exist. Whatever you want, whether you like to fight against the existence of God or for the existence of God, Freud is interested in what is that libidinal desire, what's going on there. So in terms of then the function of religion, the best thinker you're going to be looking at this week who talks about this is Feuerbach. And Feuerbach, he's a very minor philosopher. He never became a major figure, but he's my favourite minor philosopher. And he was a scholar of religion. He was very educated in theology, and he was a philosopher. And he was so sympathetic to Christianity. He was like, I love Christianity. He wrote a book on Luther. He was fascinated by the text. And as I said earlier, he said that I am a friend of the theologians. But ultimately, he wanted to say that theology ultimately is a way of speaking about ourselves in a way that we are not aware of. And so Feuerbach, he is really, in many ways, the precursor to what we call transference today. And I'm going to use an example in our own lives to make sense of what Feuerbach's saying, and then I'm going to expand it. Because what Feuerbach is saying is deeply psychologically insightful. Many of us, if we are critiquing somebody, often we will find the very thing that we are critiquing in the other, the very thing that we see in the other person that we don't like, can be a reflection of something in ourselves that we don't like. Now, we don't know that, so it's like if someone says, oh, I know what you're thinking. Like in psychoanalysis, somebody might say to the analyst, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that I had a dream about my mother. You know, I wasn't my mother in my dream. And the analyst will be like, oh, that's interesting. You're putting a thought into my mind. Right? Why are you putting that thought into the other person's mind? So often when you hear somebody say society thinks or you think, whatever, it can be a hint that that is something that they think, but that they are repressing, they can't admit. It's too awful for them to admit that that's within themselves. So they place it in the other. And that's called transference. And the more you're aware of transference, the more you can see it play out in our everyday lives. So what Feuerbach is saying is he's saying, okay, at a very basic level, in order to come to know yourself, the first thing you have to do is project yourself out there onto another person. Right? In psychoanalysis, this is now called the mirror stage, which is the child doesn't have a sense of themselves They're in philosophy what's called a being in itself, right? They're this being, they're a baby looking around at the world. And then gradually they start to see themselves through the eyes of their mother or their father. So say the mother holds the child in front of a mirror and says, there you are, that's you in the mirror, right? And the child identifies with what they see in the mirror. And the mother is saying, look how strong you are, look how beautiful you are. And the child begins to get an understanding of itself through these words of the mother. So the first step is projection out. The child projects out. They start to create an ego ideal. And then they have to reattach that back into themselves. This is very key with kids. So with parents, you see it, is that there's two things happen whenever, take the example of the mother holding a child in front of a mirror, but they might just hold the child in front of the child's brother or sister and say, oh, you're just like your brother. You know, look what he's doing. You're just like your sister. She's so independent. So in whatever way it happens, the child sees some external picture of itself. And then the mother or the father says, that's you. So what they do is you project out an image and then say, and that's you. They anchor the image back into the child by saying that image that you see, that's within you. Now, if that doesn't happen, you see all sorts of interesting things. So, you know, people who idolize stars, many of us do this, we idolize somebody. Often it's because you put out the ideal image onto another, but you haven't been able to, you find it difficult to reattach that, to bring it back into yourself. So that's one example of this difficulty. If the image doesn't go back into you, you impoverish yourself. Everybody else is amazing, the other is fantastic, and you're nowhere to be seen. You're kind of like, you disappear in your infatuation with your child or that pop star or whoever it is. Because in a way there's a lack of reattachment of the image. So there's three elements of this. There is I project out onto the world, onto a screen, something of who I am, and then that gets reattached back to me. I identify it, I'm alienated from it, I see it, and then I bring it back into myself. Now, there's a slight difference between what Feuerbach is saying and what the mirror stage is. And the difference is this. Feuerbach thinks that there is a human essence. That's what Marx critiqued him for, and Max Steiner and others. That it was like Feuerbach thought that there was a true essence that we project out and then we bring back. And later thinkers were more critical. They said, well, no, it's not about there's some true essence. That essence is formed by what your mother and father think, what your society values, the language you're given. So it's not some sort of eternal thing. It's very influenced by a whole pile of material factors. But that's not of major interest to us here. But the structure is important. Is that Feuerbach, in trying to explain the function of religion, what it does, he says what we needed to do in order to come to an understanding of our own potentiality, of our own essence, of what thinking subjects are, we first had to divest that, put it out into the world so that we could see it, so that we could look at it. So God is the cinema screen upon which we project the essence of humanity, what human beings are and can be, our potential and our actuality. So when we talk about justice and love and caring for our neighbour and even eternal life and all of these things, life everlasting, these are reflections of our own desires, but they're also reflections of our own potentiality. So if someone gives you money and you say, thank God for that money, you're thanking God, but actually it's the other person who did it, right? Or I give you some money because you're in trouble, and I thank God for letting me do that, for giving me the power to do that. Feuerbach has no problems with that. But what he's saying is, he says you impoverish the fact that that is humanity. Humanity has the power of love and of justice and of goodness. And even things like everlasting life, which would have been unimaginable to him, although it wasn't. But we are at a stage where maybe we're thinking about the longevity. We can extend life, and we might be able to extend life really until the thermal death of the universe, potentially sometime in the far, far future. Sadly, I don't think any of us are gonna see that, or maybe fortunately, none of us are gonna see that. So Feuerbach is going, that's why he says the secret of theology is anthropology, because he is saying that actually when we speak of God, we speak of the best of humanity. And the only problem now is that we need to realize that we impoverish ourselves if we don't find a way of reconnecting that with humanity and living into it and living up to it and expressing that within ourselves. And for him, that's the secret of theology, that communal water has to be turned into real water that will sate people's thirst, that communion wafers need to be turned into real food for those who are hungry, that the heavenly kingdom of peace and prosperity needs to be found here in the midst of the world as we care for each other. And so Feuerbach always just felt that he was part of the next move of Christianity, which would be this realization of the gods, and God is a reflection of not ourselves as individuals, but ourselves as a community, what we are capable of as a society. So that's this three-part structure. I'll bring Marx into this very briefly as well. Marx, you'll be reading his famous line that religion is the opiate of the people. But you'll also see this week that it goes on and it says it is the heart of a heartless nation, the soul of a soulless condition. And when you read the quote in context, what you find is that Marx is actually saying that religion is the response to suffering. That religion is not something bad or evil or wrong. It is often the way that people cope with the horror of life, the difficulty of life, homelessness, not able to pay your bills, not able to working in a job that destroys you, that you give your best to, that makes you ill. And religion, just like alcohol can sometimes do, or art or other things, religion can be a way to turn that suffering into something that is manageable and bearable. And Marx says that religion can be the flowers, the imaginary flowers on the chains of our oppression. And he says that we must get rid of the flowers, not so that we see our chains and despair, but so that we can break our chains and pick living flowers. It's quite a beautiful image, and it's similar to alcoholism. If you have a friend who's an alcoholic and they're killing themselves, you might have an intervention. Bring together family and friends, sit down with this person and say, you're destroying yourself. You've got difficult things in your life. The alcohol is your way of avoiding it. We're not judging you for that, but you've got to stop drinking because you're going to kill yourself. Now, you don't do that because you hate the person and you want them to see how terrible their life is, right? You know that if they stop drinking, they're going to have to face some difficult things. It's the imaginary flowers on the chains of their oppression, but you know that they have to get rid of the imaginary flowers, not so that they despair, but so that they might be sober enough to begin to break the chains, make the differences in their life, repair the relationships that are damaged, look for a better job, look for a way out of the situation they're in, right? And they can't do it while they're taking the alcohol. So when Marx talks about the opiate, he's saying that's the painkiller. It's the thing that you're taking in order to cope with the difficulty of life. But in order to make a change in this life, you should get off the painkiller, look at life full on, straight up, and face it. And then we can begin to make real changes that will make our lives materially better, all of our lives better. So that's Marx. So what's interesting, people think of Marx as being very anti-religion, but you'll see in his reflection that there's something actually quite sympathetic. His main concern is just that it might prevent us from doing something. And that's what you see in Joe Hill, right? Joe Hill, Reflection is a song you're going to get. And Joe Hill was a fascinating guy. And he used to watch the Salvation Army sing a song, which the song, I forget the author of the song, but it's the song that says you'll, in the sweet by and by, you'll, what's it? Sweet by and by, in that beautiful place up high. Basically, it's this song about heaven. You'll know it. I just can't literally remember it right now. But he would see the Salvation Army singing this song to these miners who had been working horrific hours, who were getting black lung, who were coughing their guts out and dying early. And he made a parody song. And it's the song which says, you will have pie in the sky when you die. And he called the Salvation Army the Starvation Army. And in that song, basically what he's saying is the Salvation Army are trying to make you feel better about your life, that you'll go to a better place in the next life, that makes you keep working in the mines. But what you need to do is not have this hope that helps you bear your current material existence. You need a hope that will change your current material conditions. So the religious hope that these people are critiquing is like the hope that, the hope that after I die, I'll get a big mansion in the sky. So I'm homeless now, but in the next life, I'm going to get a mansion, whatever, right? That's a hope that stops me from doing anything. But think about it like if you hope that your kids will go to university. If you hope that your kids will go to university, you will likely start saving. You'll likely read to them. You'll try to get them into a good school, etc., etc. That is a hope that gets you to do something material. And so someone like Joe Hill and Marx is saying that we need not a hope that prevents you from acting. We need a hope that gets you to act, that actually gets you to make a change here and now. And although we may not see the better world, it's still preferable to fight for it. It's still a better life to try to make a better world, even if we're not the people who will see it, even if we're the ones who will plant a seed and we will not see it grow into a great tree. We can still feel happy that we are planting that seed. And so there's something very beautiful about that notion of hope. But their notion of the function of religion, Joe Hill's notion of the function of religion is that religion is there to make you feel better about life, and Marx, but doesn't necessarily motivate you to make the big changes. Again, Marx is not interested in the existence or inexistence of God in this piece. It's the function of religion, and he worries that it gets us to be too esoteric. And then finally, I just want to mention the end of religion. Yes. So we've done the history. They're interested in the history of Christianity. They're interested in the genesis of Christianity. They're interested in explaining the function of Christianity. On that, by the way, Emma Goldman is probably the harshest about religion. And they're interested in the end of religion. What I mean is all of them in different ways are imagining a time in which religion might dissipate. Some of them are more skeptical than others. So Emma Goldman is more confident that the religious world is diminishing, secularization theory. Others, like Nietzsche, are more skeptical, and Freud. They are thinking that religion is much more deeply embedded in us than we first imagine. And this is why you'll be reading the Death of God parable, which is the most famous parable in philosophy probably, where Nietzsche talks about a madman who screams out to people that God is dead. I won't give it to you because you're going to be reading it this week. But in that parable, it's interesting because Nietzsche's talking about the death of God. And the death of God in philosophy means the loss of the grounding of morality and our anchoring in the world. The death of God is this experience in which all of the solid melts into air, and we don't know whether we're up or down or left or right. It's kind of like this existential crisis. And for Nietzsche, we have to experience this death of God. And by the way, next week we'll get into the theologians who agree with him, the crucifixion, right? That we have to embrace this death of God in order to get to somewhere better. But what's interesting about the parable that you'll notice, just saying this so that you can be aware of it when you're listening to it, is that he's not talking to people who believe in God. He's talking to people who don't believe in God. He says the marketplace is full of people who have no belief in God. And the madman is saying to them, you have killed God. And then he says that the lightning of the death of God may have hit. In other words, people say, oh, I don't believe in God anymore. That's not something that I'm into, right? The enlightened civilians, the scientists and the philosophers are like, oh, I don't believe in God. So the lightning is hit. But he says the thunder is yet to be heard. The thunder is a long way off. And what he means by the thunder is the actual experience of that. And he's thinking about how you can no longer believe in God and yet continue to exist in the world in a very religious way, treating commodities in a type of religious way, still seeking the type of certainty and satisfaction that is promised in religion, but finding it in money or fame or looking the right way or going out with the right person. Or you can still have a notion of chosen people, but it might be your people are chosen, or the people who are going to bring civilization to the masses. Whatever it is, we still can have very religious ideas. Carl Schmitt, the great political theorist, said that all great political theories are secularized religious theories, the ideas of sovereignty, etc. And so we think we're not religious, but we are. We just don't know it. And this is one of the big critiques that I make and others about humanism and atheism is, someone can say that they don't believe in, say, ghosts, but they're still afraid of ghosts. You don't believe there are sharks under the bed, but at night you think there are, right? There's a whole pile of things that we don't consciously believe, but we're still caught up in. We're not aware of it at all, this unconscious dimension. And Nietzsche was very, very sensitive to that. In fact, he also says at one point that there's a myth that after the Buddha died, there was a shadow of the Buddha remained on a cave wall for 100 years or more. And he said we must not just get rid of God, but also the shadow of God that remains. And what he's thinking about there is, again, this notion that we can still, in our secular world, be very, very religious. And that is very difficult to get rid of. But that we have to, for Nietzsche, in order to get to somewhere beyond nihilism. And Freud is similar. Freud is, as I said, the idea that whenever your father or your mother dies, you can still be enthralled to that, even more so in your inner life. And for some people who are always trying to please their fictional parent, who chooses their degree in light of what their parents would want, they don't know they're doing it, but they're doing it, and so they end up desiring what they don't desire. They end up doing what they don't want to do. It's a very interesting dilemma where you can be actually desiring, wanting something that you really don't want. You're doing a law degree when really there's something about an art degree that really appeals to you more. So you have to figure out, why am I doing this law degree? Who am I doing it for, right? In the same way for Freud, is like that the gods might die, but they can remain alive within us in an unconscious way. We remain, and like Marx said this in one of his most famous passages in Capital. He said that commodities are theological categories. They have all of these metaphysical niceties. In other words, we know that that car is not going to make us live forever or make us super attractive or transform our lives. We know it. It's just a car. I mean, it might be a nice car. It'll get us from A to B. But we treat it as if it will do those things. We treat it as if it's going to somehow transform our lives. So it's a kind of a religious fetishistic object. So there you go. I'm just going to finish up with maybe just try to pull all of that together in some sort of way. And again, I've given you a lot here. You're just going to be reading a little bit of these different thinkers this week. I hope you kind of, at least one of them appeals to you, and you end up this year going a little bit deeper. But just to say that these people are dialectically going in the opposite direction of the mystics. They're going into the earthiness, the profane, the grittiness of religion. And they're not doing it in order to fulfill Christianity. Feuerbach, maybe he sees that, but the others are trying to maybe get beyond Christianity. Next week, we're going to see some people who go this direction precisely because they think this is the heart of Christianity. I'd say Feuerbach's a bit of a, could fit in that group as well a little bit. But these people take seriously the grittiness of religion, what we and religious people say about God. Secondly, they offer natural alternative understandings of the genesis of religion. They're not arguing against the supernatural explanation, but they're offering natural explanations. Thirdly, they talk about the function of religion. For Feuerbach, the function of religion is to give us insight into ourselves so that we can begin to understand what we as humanity can do. Theology is a necessary step in our self-understanding. For Marx and Joe Hill and Goldman, also the function of religion is a way of helping us avoid the suffering of life. And Marx is very sympathetic to why we would want to do that. But that ultimately, if we're going to change the world, we need to begin to give up those notions in order to start to try and make changes here. And they talk about the end of religion, which is a point when we may not need this speculative understanding of another world, another life, because either with Feuerbach we are living that, we become the embodiment of God, we see that what God is the expression of what we are as a species, and we live that out. Or for someone like Marx, we make life bearable. Now, by the way, Marx is not saying we're going to make life wonderful. You're still going to have heartbreak. You're still going to stub your toe. You're still going to get diseases, right? It's whenever there's a beautiful line by Freud. They said, I want to take misery and make it into everyday unhappiness, which sounds very depressing, but actually everyday unhappiness isn't too bad. It's hysterical misery that's really destructive. Marx wants to, he's not going to wipe away every tear, but he wants to make life much more bearable and even enjoyable in its economic sense, right? And then we will feel less and less need to have these kind of religious escapes, these superstitious escapes. So that's kind of the function of religion. And then the end of religion, at the end of religion, they're thinking about, yes, we can get to a point where we somehow are able to embrace our finitude. We are able to create a world that is better for everybody. Say it's not perfect. It's not about happiness for everybody. It's just a world that is more bearable, where we are more free to pursue our endeavors. I heard somebody recently say that, for someone like Marx, you'll have more time for reading a good book. This is a guy in Zero Books, by the way. I forget his name off the top of my head, but I said, if we have this beautiful time where we don't have to all work super hard and we've got more free time, you'll be able to write the book you want to write. But you may discover that you're a terrible writer. So, that's not going to change. Sometimes it's better not to realize your dreams because you might not be very good at what you want to do, but you'll still be able to do it. And life might be a little bit more bearable. Now, I would love you to, when you're engaging in this week's materialist readings, really feel that grittiness and that desire for a heaven on earth, or a transformation of earth. And maybe that the beauty of religion is that it's connecting us with each other at its best, or helping us see something in ourselves. And then next week is very exciting, because next week we're going to see a very similar type of approach, an embrace of the profane, but much more theological. Again, what we did in the week before last, the New Atheist, that was like a philosophical critique, and then we had a theological response. This is now a philosophical critique. Next week will be a theological response. So we'll see some thinkers who do exactly the same as these people. They go all the way into the profane, but that is where they go, because they feel that is infidelity to their Christian tradition.